Years ago, I came to Chatauren, and as you can see, there's a lot of brush to get to where you want to go. What initially attracted me to Chatauren was the Hermes Temple. So I'm ascending down the ravine, and then you have to ascend the central ridge. And it's not easy getting up there for two reasons. Number one, it's kind of steep, and also you have heavy brush that has grown up over the past 2,000 years. I looked off to my left, but I noticed a lintel that is the top of a door, and it had what appeared to me to be a menorah, which very much surprised me. Kind of took a second look because I had never read about a menorah being here at this site. And so I took several photographs, and I thought that as I researched the literature that I would find that somebody has seen this synagogue previously. At that point I was assuming it was a synagogue because most lintels that have a menorah etched upon them are synagogues. And then over the next several years, as I was researching the literature, I couldn't find anything, nothing, which puzzled me because this would be a significant development, a significant discovery. Finally, I found an article that was written more than 125 years ago by a British explorer by the name of J. Theodore Bent. He had been here with his wife. They were touring Cilicia and had visited many sites. And they kept diaries, and they described Chatauren. They didn't call it Chatauren because they didn't know what the name of this place was. Chatauren is actually a Turkish term to describe the place. I know that Bent was describing this because he very accurately described the Hermes Temple and some of the inscriptions. But interestingly, Theodore Bent never mentioned the synagogue. And not surprising, because even today, it's hard to get around on this site. And so as he was probably like me, ascending this central ridge, looking at the fortification walls, and in particular, looking at the Hermes Temple, no doubt that occupied the bulk of his attention. That's what he was more interested in. You can see that the menorah is crudely cut. What is also noticeable and interesting is that the lintel is heavily pitted because of the weather beating that this has taken over the last, 2,100 years. Later on, in the Byzantine period, lintels had a more stylized form. But again, the fact that this is a crude, primitive menorah helps to indicate that this is an early menorah, not a later menorah. Then we couple that together with the construction. Once again, this is polygonal construction, typical of the Hellenistic period. And again, that helps us to date and understand when this menorah was etched and when this building was first constructed. You notice that the pitting is not only over the lintel, but also all through the menorah, which indicates that this menorah was not etched into the lintel later on in time, but was a part of it originally. One other feature I want to point out is if you look very carefully at the lintel and look over to the right of the lintel, you see another object that is etched into the lintel. So when I did more research, I came to the conclusion that that is Zeus's thunderbolt. And so the question is, what is a pagan symbol for Zeus, a thunderbolt, doing on a Jewish synagogue?
That, I think, is one of the really special things about him, because it's that dedication and passion for exploration that has allowed him, or has facilitated him, discovering the things that he has, interacting with people on a very personal level, people who may have never met a Westerner before. And it really is like that passion that you see in the 19th century with those explorers, because they didn't have internet, they didn't have GPS, they just, had in sometimes very vague ideas of where things might be, and then they just went. And sometimes there are days when Mark says, he spends looking for things, doesn't find anything, and then he'll stumble on something that he had no idea was there. And now we know, because he discovered it and documented it and probably made friends with everyone who lived in the immediate area.
Fairchild will be the first to tell you that finding a menorah does not mean you found a synagogue. But we're in luck because there's a substantial amount of evidence to prove that this is a synagogue. On the inside, there's another weather-beaten menorah in the same style as the menorah outside. Over on the facing wall, he showed us a niche where Torah scrolls were kept. And as a matter of tradition throughout the land, they faced Jerusalem. Also a matter of tradition, before you could enter the synagogue, you would be required to cleanse yourself in the mikveh, which is a ritual bath in living water. Living water is simply flowing water, and that flow comes from a cistern above, which leads to a pipe down below, thus creating flowing, living water. Right next to the mikveh were foot pads for cleansing feet. Once your feet were clean, one could walk up to the second floor, which is where women and non-Jews were allowed to listen to the Torah being read. The book of Acts calls these non-Jews God-fearers.
So when we put together this cluster of evidence, the conclusion to be drawn is pretty solid, pretty concrete. And that is the structure that we're observing here is a synagogue.
After realizing that nobody had documented the synagogue before, Fairchild quickly got to work on sharing his discovery.
So immediately I thought, well, this is something that the world would be interested to know. And so I started writing an article, got into contact with the people at the Biblical Archaeology Review, sent it in, and they were very excited to publish the article, very much interested in it. So we polished it a little bit, added a bunch of photographs, and it was published. Sometime after publication, I heard from a couple of individuals from the University of Vienna. They had evidently read the article and were very much interested in hearing more. So they invited me to Vienna University to do a presentation and to share with them what it is that I had found. And it was a good time. A lot of support and excitement and interest in what I had discovered. The lecture that I had presented was later published in the Journal of Ancient Judaism. What I also liked about it is they also published many color photographs of what I had taken at the site. So it's a great experience for me, and I think it was very helpful in terms of sharing and getting out there into the general public. I think, number one, it lends a little more credibility to the New Testament. The reason why scholars previously did not believe that synagogues dated back to the Hellenistic period or even the Roman period is because archaeologically nothing could be found. But in more recent years, synagogues have been discovered in Palestine and elsewhere that date to the Roman period. And now, the discovery that I made here at Chatty Oren, it appears as though we have a synagogue that dates back to the Hellenistic period. And so as a consequence, it's really revamping our understanding of history and Judaism during that period of time. When is it that Judaism began to come together in these structures that they were building, dedicated structures? And it's very important also because it also corroborates and substantiates what we read about in the New Testament. The New Testament tells us that Jesus went to synagogues. Acts of the Apostles tells us that Paul went to synagogues. And some people were calling into question the historicity of some of those statements in the New Testament. Now we understand that, hey, synagogues existed at that time.
And I think what we're observing here in this site is the combination of two groups of people, Jewish people and God-fearers, who have come together for common purpose, for the worship of only one God. I think a lesson that's pertinent not only for the past, but also very relevant for what's going on in the world today. We have people butting heads. We have people who are fighting with one another. A lot of it revolves around religious issues. And here we see concrete evidence at Chatty Oren that we have a pagan community who's joined together with a Jewish community. They've laid aside their differences, even religious differences, and they formed a common bond. Part of the reason for that, of course, was the common enemy that they had. The pirates, who had pushed the indigenous native residents from the coastal areas into the interior. The probability of Paul being here at Chatty Oren is quite high. Paul shared the gospel in Jewish synagogues in Cilicia. We know that this synagogue existed during the time of Paul. Paul's primary message was a message of reconciliation. God loves people, and he covets a relationship with them. At a time when we were disobedient to God, when we turned our back on God and walked away from God, he reached out to us and made peace. And so Paul says, if God's reconciling, we need to do the same thing. We need to be reconciled to people. And that's a big part of Paul's message. Reconciliation with God, but also reconciliation with people.
Chatty Oren's one of my favorite sites, maybe my most favorite site. And it's just kind of a bonus that as I'm climbing this ridge to see the watchtower and the Hermes Temple, that I discover the synagogue. So it's just exciting, a lot of fun, and just totally unexpected. I didn't come here to discover a synagogue. I came here to see what I could see from the distant road. But to find the synagogue as well, that's just a bonus. And turns out to be what is most important and significant about this site.